Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, a very controversial study linking living near golf courses with Parkinson's disease, a claim that a small drop in vaccinations could lead to measles outbreak, which isn't actually a small claim, it's rather well known at this point. A synthetic mini prion could help with the investigation of neurological diseases. A higher court decision which finds nitrogen not toxic despite having killed someone. UC Davis researchers have removed the gluten gene from certain wheat, meaning people can eat wheat-based bread that tastes at least somewhat decent without having to worry about an autoimmune disease. The Apple lawsuit over spying by Siri has been settled and you could get a very small payout. ChatGPT is affecting students' learning, and in more ways than one. And finally, we have the Martian night sky, not only turning green, but stunningly so. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with the most contentious news item this week, theoretically anyway. It's a study that has tried to claim that living near a golf course increases your risk of Parkinson's disease. Now, this is all kinds of interesting, mostly because that's the headline most people have run with. But, importantly, that's not necessarily so, and as with most research, it's not really the context that matters when it comes to the media. Instead, it's just what is the most salacious thing they can pull out of it. In short, what the researchers have found is that if they take a whole bunch of people who live in a certain area that happen to be near golf courses, and see what happens to them over a given time frame, how many incidences of Parkinson's disease are there? And there is more than usual. This by itself is really not that surprising. We would argue that just because people are old, they tend to live near golf courses because they have time to retire and enjoy themselves with their favorite leisure activity, hitting a ball somewhere and then chasing after it like a dog. Oh wait, it's called golf. Anyway, the problem with this, other than the fact that it's relatively weak research, is that it is purely observational. As such, they don't even know if it's individuals who have been living there for a long time and as such have had a long-term exposure to any kind of local conditions are actually who are getting sick, or if, as mentioned, it's people who have been elsewhere and presumably exposed to different kinds of and different concentrations of things like pesticides, herbicides, and so on, and have now moved near a golf course that are getting sick. So yeah, this research is really questionable. And yes, it could theoretically be useful, but remembering they have absolutely no adjustment or control for anything else other than the time that those people were living near that golf course. They have, in all intents and purposes, established the epitome of correlation does not equal causation. And as such, we don't really find that this particular kind of research is all that useful. More so when most kinds of Parkinson's and similar neurological diseases start up to decades before anybody shows actual symptoms or gets diagnosed. So for all we know, these people could have been working in a chemical factory and never wore a respirator up to and including the day they left, leading to the rather obvious but rather unfortunate consequence of neurological conditions. And next we have a comparison of, a drug called Tirzepatide with semaglutide, or basically Ozempic, for obesity. This is pretty much a head-to-head matchup of the more common sort of, let's say, Ozempic or Ozempic analogs that are out there. And in short, yeah, they do seem to work. Now, how well they work's a little bit different, and certainly based on different populations. And it would be nice if they certainly had a, let's say, a better kind of design, but admittedly a phase 3b open-label controlled trial's not that bad for what they're doing. They basically gave a 1-to-1 ratio of the maximum amount of dose of each drug, either 10 milligrams or 50 milligrams of the Tirzepatide, or the tolerated semaglutide, 1.7 milligrams or 2.47 milligrams, for 72 weeks. So more or less 1.5 years. The end point of this was whether or not they had lost weight at the end of that 18 months. The secondary measurement they had was basically how much weight they lost, and waist circumference reduction, which arguably is slightly less significant or useful. And they found that, yeah, there are some differences, certainly in terms of statistical significance. We would argue clinically any loss in body weight is significant, but if you have to choose one over the other, well, you can basically argue that the Tirzepatide was slightly better, at roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 70% more weight loss, but again, anything that works, works. And of course, there is one big caveat to everything that we've mentioned, and that's that Eli Lilly was funding a significant amount of this research, which, well, to be blunt about it, means you can probably question how well or how seriously to take the results. And next we have research that really does state not just the obvious, but the painfully obvious. Spreading just a small drop in vaccinations, particularly for measles, could lead to measles spreading. Understand, we need basically 95% coverage of measles through vaccination to get herd immunity. Rather obviously, 5% is a small value when we talk about herd immunity. So yeah, it's kind of obvious that any reduction would cause exactly this outcome. Admittedly, modelling of it does help a little bit in understanding how and where spread will occur, and to some extent where to focus resources, mostly very large sticks, given to very surly nurses to smack parents who don't want to vaccinate their kids with. Well, smack the parents, not the kids. Theoretically, the kids have done nothing wrong at this point, but it might be possible the kids would benefit from a stick beating anyway. Long story short though, the benefits of this are very simple. 95% coverage, or we get measles. And nobody wants measles. No matter how much people will claim that, oh no, it's better if you get it this way because natural immunity is superior. No, it's not. Natural superiority involves things like sterility, permanent scars, possible death, and all sorts of other issues that are nowhere near as prevalent or as serious with vaccines. So, no. Going to arguably again somewhat less useful news, but also news that's again not all that surprising. It's the increase in gastrointestinal cancer and why certain bacteria could be responsible. We say this could be useful as if it's true, and that's a massive if. It could actually be useful in reducing bowel cancer development rates. But the probability of it being true is kinda small. More so when they've kind of spread their study out everywhere. They've got 11 countries and not quite 1,000 individuals. So, yeah, it's not a great number because you're not really comparing an apples-to-apples scenario. It's very preliminary research that could prove useful if you can extrapolate it out to more people in the same countries. What they've basically found is that there's a certain product produced by some bacteria, mostly kinds of E. coli, called colorectal. If, and this is the great big if, it is actually responsible, being able to target this and deal with it could, theoretically, help to reduce that 3.3 times more common incidence of cancer that has this, but only for young people. If you're elderly and basically over 70, you are shit out of luck with this research because nobody cares about you, you're going to die soon. Or at least that is what the funding for this kind of research would indicate, where it's increasingly targeting young people and not old people, who would ironically be more prone to developing various kinds of cancer. In research that's more applicable to older people, we have a mini prion that's being developed in a purely synthetic capacity, and this could be useful in investigating not only things like prion disease, but mostly neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, which are arguably more useful in terms of getting to know what's going on in the brain. Prions are basically proteins that can't behave themselves and cause every other protein they come in contact with to start misbehaving too. They're like naughty children, and your body doesn't have a stick to beat them into behaving themselves with. Or a belt, a strop, or whatever it is your parent particularly used, unless they were harsh words, in which case nothing will fix those particular deep scars, except maybe the chunkler. The chunkler is scary. Why we're concerned about prion disease though, and in this case neurodegenerative diseases, is that we don't have a way to treat them. Once they start occurring, we can, for some conditions, slow it down, which is nice because you have more time with your family, assuming you want to spend time with your family. Or if you don't, well, you've just been extended for your duration of torture. But for most people, this is good news, as you not only have your brain intact, your mind intact, and you are around people you want to be with. But it doesn't stop it. You will still die, and you'll likely die with very little by way of your brain and mind working. You will be the epitome of a vegetable until your death, and there's that sad period between vegetative state and death that no one wants to be in. What makes the mini prion so useful is that you're able to track and monitor what's going on in models of the disease, essentially allowing the better understanding of what's occurring, so long as everything works as planned. Something that definitely did not work as planned is RFK Kray's attempt at influencing people to spend more time outdoors, by taking himself and his grandchildren to go swimming in sewage-contaminated water on Mother's Day. This is not the kind of thing your Secretary of Health should be doing by literally washing themselves in poop and pee water, and their children for that matter, or grandchildren in this case. For somebody who claims that they want to be all about health, this has got to be one of the worst cell phones we've seen in a very long time. And the reason for this is fairly simple. Not before long, there's a good chance that they're going to be experiencing the results of swimming in sewage, which will mostly be very similar to food poisoning, just after food's been consumed, and then consumed a second time, and not in the human centipede kind of way. The best part of all of this, to some extent in terms of irony, is that the health secretary, the person who's meant to be able to read and engage in all the correspondence that comes in, is actually the same one who failed to read the warning that says, "Stay safe while enjoying Rock Creek Park. Swimming and wading are not allowed due to high bacteria levels. Stay out of the water, protect stream banks, plants, animals, keep you and your family, including pets, safe from illness. Rock Creek has high levels of bacteria and other infectious pathogens that make swimming, wading, and other contact with the water a hazard to human and pet health. Please protect yourself and your pooches by staying on trails and out of the creek. All district waterways are subject to a swim ban. This means wading too." Oops. So yeah, we would not be surprised to see that for at least a short time after this, there was practically no news from RFK Kray, as they spent more time praying to the porcelain god than they did injecting themselves with steroids, or trying to spread anti-vaxxer nonsense. In similar government levels of crazy, we have Ohio, but it's Ohio's Supreme Court making a really dumb decision, but not just dumb, but illogical, but theoretically legally sound, which is the worst kind of correct.
Excuse me, I'm actually supposed to be getting out of prison. You're in the wrong line.
What they've decided is that nitrogen is not toxic, and therefore a widow can be denied their benefits. This all sounds weird, but it all stems from a very simple case. The case involves a man who basically suffocated to death after walking into a room filled with nitrogen gas. He's basically gone into a gas chamber, except rather than cyanide and Nazis, this was bureaucratic ineptitude, judicial oversight, and someone fucking up. And unfortunately it does lead to the same outcome, death. The corporation that was responsible for this, Timken Steel, has basically been accused of failing to provide the necessary respirator and safety equipment to them, and naturally this led to a court case. The court cases were appealed and found their way up to the Supreme Court in Ohio. The rationale behind nitrogen not being toxic is simple and straightforward. That is, by itself, nitrogen isn't dangerous, it's everywhere, and yes, it is, but it's also only everywhere in certain concentrations. We're not going around breathing in lungfuls of nitrogen. We're going around breathing in nitrogen in combination with a bunch of other chemicals. Oxygen, CO2, the list goes on. And yet the same court that claims that nitrogen is not toxic does seem to recognize, somehow, that the nitrogen killed the person involved. Now, call us crazy if you will, but we would think that if something can kill you, it is toxic at that dose. We can possibly, vaguely, somehow hope that people will do two things. One, buy these judges a basic book on chemistry to show them that this is what we mean by toxic and this is what nitrogen is, and that you can't breathe it in. Two, that this gets appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, where theoretically there may be a vague possibility that it could be overturned, and a degree of justice is actually served. The next piece of news is environmental, and it's more just hilarious as not quite on par with RFK Jr, but still kinda funny. 3 Chinese nationals were arrested in Japan after trying to give thousands of hermit crabs shared accommodation in their suitcases. The problem is that these hermit crabs were all protected species that weren't A, meant to be taken on a holiday back to China, 2, leave Japan full stop, and 3, probably didn't want shared accommodation in the suitcases. It's rather cramped, and, probably ends with them being eaten. The attempt wasn't on a small scale. There were roughly 160 kilograms of these crustaceans, these tiny little hermit crabs, stuck in 3 suitcases. So that's a lot of hermit crabs, and probably very unhappy hermit crabs, all stuck in there. The giveaway for them being in there was the rustling sound coming from said suitcases. So yeah. Unfortunately, this ends well for the hermit crabs, not so much for the diners looking forward to crab soup that night. Another food-related news, we have UC Davis working together to create a gluten-free form of wheat that will help with celiac disease. Help in terms of it makes food that's actually edible and doesn't taste like cardboard, but also helpful in terms of people with celiac disease don't have to worry about gluten, which for them is probably more important. But for everybody else who goes out to eat and has to deal with that one person who has gluten allergies or worst case gluten intolerance and insists upon ordering whatever the hell it is that comes out that resembles some sort of piece of cardboard with vague, alluring indicators it might once have been food of some description, yeah, their thing will still probably taste terrible, but it won't taste terrible because it's gluten-free. In theory, the work is fairly straightforward, but it does involve genetic engineering, genetic modification, however you wish to call this, and in the case of various anti-GMO groups, no, there are no fish genes included. They've actually removed genes from this particular kind of wheat. In fact, they've removed a number of different genes that are all responsible for producing the gluten proteins. So this wheat should theoretically be safe for consumption. But of course, given that it's a relatively niche product, we don't imagine this would actually be used for most things. And as such, you're basically going to wind up in a situation where even if it says it contains wheat and you have celiacs, it's a good idea to avoid it. But the bread does at least look mostly decent. Next we shift to use of dumb images by researchers, and it's really more this single image we want to call your attention to. Mostly because whoever took this picture has the stunning ability to find the floating blueberries. Well, no, actually, it's even worse than that. The published image was taken from an Italian stock nursery footage website, or image website, and these berries appear to have been moved not just for the sake of moving them to give it an appearance of a more abundant production of fruit, but theoretically and possibly in an effort to hide damage on the plant so that people are more likely to buy them. So it's not just that these researchers basically stole an image from somewhere else and in doing so plagiarized it, but the image itself is really bad because it literally has gravity-defying fruiting bodies. In other technology-related news, we have the lawsuit against Apple. And no, this is not the one of any number of the other lawsuits. This was the Siri spying on you lawsuit, which has been settled. Now, this should only apply to America for the most part, but depending on where you are in the world, you may or may not be able to claim on it. It is that because Siri was spying on people, and Apple has now admitted to that, for the next roughly 8 weeks from the date of the publication of the article, you could claim up to $100 to settle it, which, yeah, that sounds like a great exchange of having your privacy invaded to that extent and without your permission, or better yet, without, legal permission, like from a court. So long as it's not in a higher court, because their reasoning might actually be really tortured and go against you. What this settles is, for all intents and purposes, that not only did Apple listen into your conversations, in their words, inadvertently, but that inadvertently, which is bullshit, Apple passed this on to third parties. Now, it's not just that they pass it on to third parties. That part isn't the weird thing. It's that they pass them on to do quality checking of how Siri is dealing with your discussion, or whatever it is it's overheard. So now you have at least 3 different things that are involved in your conversation that aren't meant to be involved. Apple, Siri, and a third party. That's not the end of technology debacles this week, but it is at least the end of the Apple debacle. For now, as Apple always seems to be sued and settling for something to do with one of their devices every now and then, and certainly multiple times a year. No, instead we shift now to AI tools, and particularly things like, say, ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, and so on. And the argument that, well, AI is, to an extent, helping high-achieving students do better. Which sounds great, after all. If you can have your students perform better for having to put less effort in, they're working smarter, not harder. But, and this is the big but here, that is not necessarily the case. In fact, for a lot of students, the ability to use AI has basically taken away all of the actual work and learning they would do and allowed them to tick the box of saying, I've submitted the assignment. A lot of the time, they don't even look at the assignment to understand what it is they've done. We have two particular examples of this in practice from this week alone. One of these is, as we mentioned, that high-achieving students seem to do better when they have ChatGPT available to them. It's basically an extra tool in their toolkit, and so they can perform better. It is, however, limited to only basically being a meta-analysis of other research. So, take it with some, let's say, hesitancy. Based on what we read into this particular review article, it seems that students who can use these AI-assistive tools like ChatGPT do better, but that's because they can understand how to use the tool. Essentially, these kids would have been fine anyway, you've just given them more things to work with. But this doesn't necessarily hold true for everybody, and certainly it seems that in some respects, not necessarily based on this research, but articles to come, that students who essentially can't use things like ChatGPT well will struggle more when they're available, as it widens the gap between them. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that you're not necessarily getting students who are learning so much as they are parroting what it is you say. Or in this instance, they're parroting what ChatGPT, amongst others, has said. This is evidenced by certain quotes relating to an assignment where the professor who made the assignment made it in such a way that it was AI-proofed, and the students' objections included that they were interfering with their learning style, that ChatGPT was down, the assignment was due, and that the students are being asked to go from point A to point B, and why can't they use a car to get there? And the worst one of all is simply everybody's doing it, which does invariably raise the question of, well, if everybody else is jumping off a bridge, would you do it too? But we're more concerned about the other 3 points. The first of which is, if you don't know what's between A and B, it doesn't matter if you get there faster, because if the point is not necessarily the destination, but the journey, to use that ridiculous euphemism. Next is the argument that ChatGPT was down, which is purely a failure on the student. They didn't do their work in a timely manner. And finally, learning styles. This is not learning, this is parroting. Learning is when you understand the content and the topic, and therefore could have arguably done so without ever having to actually do anything in terms of ChatGPT. It's just ChatGPT, it makes it a bit easier for you. Shifting to the final technology news item we have for you, it's court documents relating to Google, which is a certain irony given that this is being put up on YouTube. What it basically shows is that in terms of the search results delivered to the regular user, it doesn't make a difference at all in any way, shape or form whether or not they are being served dedicated, marketed and targeted ads. What it does do is make a difference to Google's bottom line. In short, the only thing that the marketing monopoly Google has in terms of benefit is to benefit Google. It doesn't make any difference to the user, which is a problem because this only further serves to undermine what you could best describe as Google's primary defense. That is, we provide the best results to people by having targeted ads, which this generally shows is not actually true. This problem, let's say for Google, is really augmented by the fact that Google has, for a very long time, tried to generate this image of, we're giving you the best, most appropriate, most accurate results to what you're asking us for, which is often not necessarily the case. What they're providing most of the time is the most useful and accurate results for Google. which is generally going to involve the exchange of a certain amount of money for advertising purposes. Shifting to news that's literally out of this world, and thankfully so, as it seems like Earth is getting kind of we have the Martian night sky, also turning a kind of colour green. Literally, it looks kind of like dirty, mucky water. We have no doubt that RFK Jr would find it incredibly appealing to swim in, admittedly until he suffocated and or exploded from the vacuum. But ignoring the fact that his blood would boil inside his body, we have basically auroras occurring on Mars. Notably that these auroras are somewhat distinct and different from what you'd see on Earth, mostly because Mars lacks both an atmosphere, or at least a substantial atmosphere, and to a lesser extent the necessary magnetic waves and magnetic field to get the right kind of reaction from the solar radiation. And nonetheless, it does produce a particularly nice green coloration, very similar to, say, arsenic green used in the Victorian and Edwardian era. This actually does kind of suit it, given, as mentioned, the relative deadliness of being within it. Unlike Earth, where you regularly get its rather spectacular auroras occurring in the visible light spectrum, most of Mars doesn't have that luxury. Instead, just about all of it has been within the ultraviolet wavelength, which is not visible to the human eyesight, sadly, although we can make it so with the appropriate aids and technology. To get a approximation of what this would look like if you were to see it on Earth, you can just watch your own regularly occurring auroras, because we are seeing basically exactly the same phenomena, just on Mars. The final news item we have is going to take us even further away from Earth and all the way to Jupiter, where Jupiter is not quite getting stupider, but it is definitely getting more colourful with its own auroras. These are arguably somewhat more stunning than what we saw on Mars, but they're also somewhat more regular. It's just that we don't often see them, because, well, Mars is not only closer to Earth, we have rovers on its surface, and, well, Jupiter's further away and it has no real physical surface we can put a rover on, because if we tried that, it would be crushed by the sheer pressure of falling to the very tiny core that Jupiter has. It's not as though we haven't ever captured footage of this before, but what is distinct here is just the quality of the image and some of the things we're seeing now with the better James Webb Space Telescope in use. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.